I really believe, and it's on my website, I believe three things about every human being, so certainly every man. And I believe they can all be proven. And the first one is we were created to be courageous.
So welcome to the True Man Podcast. What does it really take for us to understand how short life is and that we need to take advantage of it? I mean, really, I think we've all said from time to time that we know how short life is, and how many of us do and say that about life when something happens that is, a tragedy or a loss. Why does that have to be the thing that spurs us on? Well, the reality is there are no practice rounds in life. There's no playing games. We get what we get, and Lord willing, we can look back at our lives and say, job well done. But the reality is we don't all get that shot to say that. And sometimes we're left with memories of someone who left us all too soon that definitely didn't get that shot. So let's talk about that today. Welcome to the True Man Podcast, Clint Hatton. Clint is a coach and a speaker and an author of the book, Big, Bold, Brave, How to Live Courageously in a Risky World. Now, this book was inspired by his son, Gabriel, who was tragically killed in a plane crash that he was piloting. Clint, welcome to the True Man Podcast.
Good morning, Mike. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, listen, I'm looking forward to this conversation. So Clint and I were introduced through a mutual business that we're a part of. I would encourage you to take a look at Givers University. And I went to your website after you reached out to me, and I was really just blown away by your story. So talk about the idea of how big, bold, and brave came about.
Yeah, Mike. Well, Big, Bold, Brave, a lot like life, was just kind of something that unfolded along the journey. It wasn't something that I certainly set out to do years ago. It wasn't part of my, 5-10 year plan or anything like that. It really just came out of, as you stated earlier, we never know exactly which cards we're going to be dealt, right?
Nope.
And so we were dealt some cards. And so when that happens, you have a couple of choices. And so ultimately Big, Bold, Brave came out of that. But how it all started is, we'll go to my son, Gabriel. He was my oldest, and from a very young age, a real, we might say, go-getter. I would say definitely incredibly adventurous. He was also really smart. All three of my boys are smart, and we all love all of our kids, right? But he had this brain that just worked a little bit differently. Anything that he decided he wanted to do, it was pretty much a done deal. Now, by contrast, anything that he didn't want to do was a major battle. And I think I know as a dad, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, we all know a little bit about that. Yeah.
So there was a measure of that too, especially when he was younger. But ultimately what happened with him is he, at about 8 years old, he went up in a small aircraft with his uncle Danny, who's a pilot, and he just became a junkie immediately. He just started saying, I want to be a pilot. I want to be a pilot. And so, at 8, that's not really a big concern for us.
Right.
There's some time for that.
Not too many 8-year-old pilots running around.
There's not. And so ultimately we just said, okay, great. But he never let go of it, Mike. I mean, he really it was a thing. And so by the time he got to high school, there were some opportunities that opened up. And I want to frame it this way too, because I think it's important as we have this conversation, because there's a lot of questions that come up when things don't go our way, right? But I think what I want to point out is, I was a pastor for 17 years up until just January this year. And so we were pastors when he went into high school. And as most people would know, you don't get into that for the, 6, 7, 8-figure income, right? So we did not have the resources to send him through a school to become a pilot in his high school years.
Yeah, I've heard, I don't know this for fact, it's not exactly an inexpensive hobby.
No, it's not. I mean, actually, I've had other experiences with other people before even Gabriel, like my brother, came really close, but he had put down like 10, 15 grand and still wasn't
Yeah.
quite there yet. And it can cost more too. It just depends on where you go and, the type of planes you're flying and that kind of stuff. But anyway, and so the reason why that's important is we just believe that, okay, God, if this is a door you want to open for him, then, you're going to have to open the door. And so here's what happened. The doors didn't just open. They flung wide open. He ended up in high school. We'd actually recently moved back. We had a position at a church in Washington State up near Seattle. We had just moved back here to McKinney, Texas, which is Dallas, where we are, not even knowing that the high school that he was about to start had a 4-year aviation program on the educational side of things. Yeah, which there's not. I'm pretty sure still to this day, because that's hasn't been that long ago. There's only a few. There's not many that have that kind of a track. Yeah, I know. So that was like, okay, favor of God number one, And then he joined a club his freshman year. It's called Tango 31 Aero Club. And this is a club it's at a small airport. It's about 7 minutes from our house. And it was formed by a gentleman by the name of Kevin Lacey. And so Kevin Lacey started this club for teenagers. And he did that largely because he I guess, didn't get a lot of help from his father growing up, and he had to make his own way. And he's become somewhat of a legend. Some of your listeners may even know who he is. He had a show, I think it's still on Discovery Channel, but he was a star of the show Airplane Repo, which is exactly what it sounds like. And so
I remember that being advertised. When you said the name, I'm like, why does the name sound? It's kind of a common name, but I do recall that show. Yeah.
So as you can imagine, the title is exactly what it is. So this guy has made a career of repoing just about everything you can possibly think of, from seaplanes in Alaska to, Gulf Stream, whatever, just everything in between. So he's this salty, great guy, but he started this thing for teenagers. And what it is it's a club, and it only costs us $50 a year. So I'm going to let that sink in. Yeah. I'm going to let that sink in when I tell you what it involved. So $50 a year to join this club. So we're like, oh, well, that's wonderful. Yeah, we can do that. So the first thing that happens is that the first couple of years there, they have them just working on all kinds of different parts of the plane. He teaches them aircraft maintenance, and they painted planes. And ultimately, as this club developed, because Gabriel was one of the first members of this club, they eventually end up doing complete engine overhauls and just about everything you can think of. But what happened is once you get to about that 16-year-old stage, as long as you've earned it through sweat equity, which he had, then there's flight instructors who donate their time.
Wow.
To take kids up. So literally he started flying. Didn't cost us a dime. As a matter of fact, even the fuel we got at wholesale. So very little cost. And Gabriel actually earned a $1,000 scholarship from American Airlines as well, that ultimately ended up paying for almost this entire thing. The only thing we ever paid by the time he got his license was $350 or something like that for the actual exam. So, we just felt like there was favor, and it was amazing. And so he's flying with an instructor, and then still at 16 years old, he ended up soloing for the first time before he even had a driver's license, which was exciting and scary and weird.
I was just going to say, I got a little nervous when you said that.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I remember my wife and I obviously were there the very first time he ever went up by himself. And I'll never forget, because there's this kind of a lot like life, right? There was this mixture of emotions, because as he's getting in, and more importantly, what happens is the flight instructor gets out, because they go up together first, and then he gets out and shuts the door. And as he's starting to take off, it's like, man, this is exciting. My other son's an athlete. I was an athlete. It's kind of like that, it's like you're in the stadium, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Until he got up in the air and started circling. Then all of a sudden, a whole different emotion takes over, and it's one we're very familiar with, called fear.
Yeah.
So like, oh my, he's up there now. He's got to come down. And so I'll never forget the first time he landed. It was really smooth. We were blown away. We're like, wow, that was really great. He liked to say like butter when he would perfectly, but anyway, so he, he's flying. And then by the time you're 17 is the youngest you can be and actually apply for and earn a private pilot's certificate. So at 17, he studied, he took the exam, passed it the first time, did his check ride, passed with flying colors. Boom. He became a licensed pilot.
Wow.
And so, and even during that time, this is just prior to COVID, which would change a little bit what I'm about to say, as it changed many things. But just prior to COVID in the airline industry, it was absolutely the perfect time for a young pilot to be moving into that industry, because just the way the pilot cycle has worked, there was an enormous amount of pilots nationwide that were nearing retiring age. So we had connections with American Airlines, and they had a pipeline here in Dallas. And I mean, everything, Mike, everything looked like it was just lined up. So one day he gets a call from a friend of his, and she attended the University of Arkansas, which is a few hours north of us, and asked, hey, I'm here over the weekend for a funeral. Is there any way you could fly me back to Arkansas? Because, I'm trying not to miss any more school than I need to. And of course, any pilot, not just young in age, but any new pilot, everything's about hours. So it was not unusual for him to take any opportunity whatsoever to go jump in his plane. And so they do. And they fly up to the University of Arkansas. He drops her off. Things are great. Jumps back in his aircraft. And about 20 minutes on his return flight out of Fayetteville, he ran into an unexpected weather system and ended up flying into the side of a mountainside and lost his life. So all of those dreams, all of those, goals, just everything just vanished in an instant. And our lives were quite literally turned upside down.
Yeah.
And changed forever. And so it started us on this new journey, which ultimately leads us to your question of, what is big, bold, brave? And so with, for us, what, other than the obvious, right? The obvious here is that was an excruciating turn of events.
Yeah.
But over my lifetime, I've nothing that compares to this in terms of just sheer depth of loss and meaning, as far as what he means to us. But, over the course of my lifetime, I had some pretty crazy things hit at about 12 years old. Again, later when I was in my early 20s, I had a 9-year stretch where I actually was a meth abuser. Ended up in a divorce during that season of my life. But then when I got married to my bride now, who we've been married almost 20 years come April, we've had some other hits. We had premature babies, and my youngest was born at 1 pound, 14 ounces, 3 months early. We've lived through some pretty extreme circumstances, and some of the value systems, certainly our faith being foundational to that, have definitely helped us manage and cope through life. And life is a mixed bag, Mike. That's what I like to say it. It really is. We have, at the same time, here's the thing, what a lot of people who have never suffered a tragedy don't quite understand, and I'm glad, because that means they would have to go through it, is that you can at the same exact time be in incredible pain and yet have components of your life that you're experiencing even joy. You can be very, very sad and distraught, and then moments later have an incredible peace. It's a mixed bag. Life has this ebbs and flows. So when it hit, the first thing that we had to face, and what I had to face as the man, as the leader of my home, was my youngest sons, who were 9 and 14 at that time, slept through the night. They had no idea what had been going on. And we don't have to get into the weeds of what happened that night. But in short, we got the call from Kevin that he disappeared off the radar around 8 p.m. on that night, on the 23rd. There was ebbs and flows all throughout the night, confusion. We couldn't get any straight answers from the sheriff's department that was in charge of the search and rescue. It was a very rural area where he went down. There was no cell phone coverage. They're telling us there's nothing to report, while the news agencies, ABC, NBC in Fayetteville, are slowly leaking information.
Yeah.
So that went throughout the night, but ultimately it wasn't until 3:30 a.m. that all hope we had, because we had prayed all night, we had worshiped all night, we had read scriptures, we had, prayed out loud about his destiny and his future, and just hopes that he was going to be okay. And at 3:30, it was just over. And so we didn't wake them up. And when they got up, brought them out into the living room. By then, a set of grandparents were here, which was very unusual. So they could tell by looking at us that obviously something was not right. But Mike, I had the inevitable task of having what I call the impossible conversation.
Yeah.
And so here's what I knew. And here's, if we had any advantage at all, it would have been this, because we had no advantage in the pain department. It was incredibly, and is very painful.
Yeah.
But my years of being a pastor, my years of, helping people and seeing people not cope well with different types of tragedies. And, unfortunately, so many times we hear about marriages that end up in divorce after the loss of a child, families that just completely disintegrate. And so I was very aware of that, even though I was in a lot of pain. So here's how we launched out. And this is ultimately where Big Bold Brave would come from. I looked at the boys and I said, we have two choices. We can choose today to have what I didn't use this word back then, but I'm going to use it for your listeners because I want to kind of frame it for everybody that's listening.
Sure.
What I call a death mentality. Death mentality is this. I said, boys, we can choose for the rest of our lives to focus on his death, the tragedy of it, that he died flying a plane, that he died trying to achieve his dreams, that he died and we're never going to be able to see him again, and all the things that go along with that. And if our focal point, keyword, if our focal point is on the death and the loss, our lives are going to be shadows of what they were meant to be, of what I believe we were created to be. But there's a second choice. And the second choice is what I call a life mentality. I said, boys, we can look at how Gabriel lived his life. And what I didn't share with you yet is, yes, he was a pilot, which is a pretty amazing accomplishment at that age, but he taught himself guitar. He actually played in the worship team in a pretty short amount of time, which was pretty amazing. He was an amazing photographer. We're so blessed. You can actually see one of the photos he took behind that train. I have probably thousands of photos that he took. He was the type of person that just attacked life. Everything was an adventure. He didn't let anything get in his way. Sure, he had fear. I'm sure he had fear when he got into a cockpit, but he never allowed fear to dictate his life and what he was going to choose to do. And so I said, boys, the only way we can honor his life is if we do the same thing. And we're going to do different things. We have different passions. But if we choose that, if we choose to just live our lives the way he lived, then we're going to honor him.
How did the boys accept that initially?
They did in the moment, but for sake of, reality, there's only so much you can totally be in agreement with and comprehend. Even what I was saying, I understood in theory what I was saying. But it's a whole other thing to begin to live it out, which actually there is a part two. I'm glad you asked that. The part two was, as I said, now that said, we don't know what the grieving process is going to look like for each of us, because it's going to be different. We're not all going to experience the same thing at the same exact time. So here's how we're going to do that. We're going to do it as a family. And the way that's going to look is, it doesn't matter what emotion you're feeling. It could be sadness and you need to cry. It could be anger. And, as a habit, we don't cuss as a family, but I literally said, if you need to cuss because you're so angry, it's okay. If you want to laugh, because, Joy's involved in this too. We remember things that he did and just funny things, and stuff like that, that any emotion is appropriate during the grieving process. Nothing is off limits. But the key is we're going to have to do this together. So ultimately what that would mean was we would have to be okay with how each other is feeling, even if we didn't feel the same way in that moment. Like maybe I'm feeling great, for example, but I can see my wife she looks heavy. I've got to be willing to have that, what I call courageous conversation, to go, baby, how are you doing with Gabriel? And that doesn't sound like much, but it's really important because most people bury that stuff.
Yes.
And they're afraid to ask that question for two primary reasons. One is they don't want to feel the trigger. So it's almost, a defense mechanism against them processing their own griefs. Like, I feel pretty good right now. So gosh, I'm afraid to find out whether or not they're not doing okay. And then the second thing is they're afraid that if they are okay, that I'm going to trigger them, but it was a really critical mechanism that we put in place that we have been doing. It's a little over 3.5 years now. And Mike, we're still in pain. The pain's never going to leave us.
Right.
It's our son. The pain represents the love that we share. So that's not even a goal. But to your point a minute ago, how did they receive it? They received it. As a matter of fact, I don't always share this story, but another thing that happened that morning, and this all plays into this big, bold, brave, which we'll eventually get to why that phrase even exists. But a foundation here, I think, is really critical. So that morning, dude, it's a Tuesday. That's the thing about tragedy, is you're in the midst of this tragedy. Life has completely spun you upside down, and yet it's still a work day. It's still a school day. It's still Tuesday. And so we talked to the boys, and we kind of got through this whole, just laying out what I call the compass of how we're going to handle this from a grieving process and just mindset. And then I said, okay, boys, you get to decide, or at least we didn't say they could decide on their own, but let's talk about, we want you to be part of the decision on what you do this week, because it was only Tuesday. And so at that point we said, listen, Joel is the middle son. He's 18 now. And then Liam was 9 at the time. He's now 13. Said, you guys just think about it for a little bit. There's no rush, but you decide, do you want to go back to school this week? Do you want to stay home? You need to know whatever you want to do. We're going to support it, but let's talk about it, and let's talk about why. And so Joel, who was at that point a freshman in high school, and he's my football player, he didn't even hesitate. He immediately said, I'm going to school. I'm going to school today because I'm going to play for my brother. Now, what that meant was, this is a Tuesday. The next day, freshmen don't play on Friday night, so it's not Friday night lights unless you're on varsity. They play on Wednesday. So the next day was literally their homecoming game. So I'll admit, Mike, when he said that, it was almost too quick. And I'm thinking, okay, all right.
Yeah.
I get it, but let's back off. And so we talked about it for a little bit, but he was resolute. So we ended up making an appointment. I called the principal of the school. He goes to a 6A school in here in Texas. So it's 3,000 students, pretty big school. So we ended up sitting down with her and a couple of grief counselors, and just need to make sure that he had the right setting, that if he struggled emotionally throughout the day, he knew where he could go and where he could get help. And
sure.
So we did that. So then the next day was the game. And I remember we showed up to that game. Now, he was a running back at that time, and he's a playmaker. I'll say that up front, but this is one of those things where he's telling everybody, I'm going to play for his brother, and we show up to the stadium. It's a day after Gabriel's death. I'm struggling as we're walking in there thinking, should I have allowed this? As the leader of this family, is this a bad decision? I remember looking around the crowd thinking, how many people know? Because we knew it was news, but we didn't know how many people knew.
Yeah.
And this is a freshman game, so usually there's only about 100 people there. It's freshmen, so it's not like it's this huge stadium. But I looked around. I'm thinking, how many people just think, oh, those poor people? Because even though I know it's a tough story, we didn't want it to be our identity.
Yeah.
All these thoughts run through my mind, but not the least of which is, how's this going to go? Because what ended up happening, there was like 100 extra people, which for a freshman game felt like a lot of people that had heard about it, that were people that we knew in the community and that knew Gabriel and knew Joel, and they show up with these big signs to support Joel. And, now there's this added pressure. And I'm telling you, Mike, it was like a storybook. Cause I've been asked, does football really matter? in a moment like that? And the answer is yes. And the answer is because it mattered to Joel. And on his first carry, they actually did not put him in the game the first couple of plays. I still this day don't really know if that was by design or not, but it just added to my anxiety. And he goes in on his first play. They throw him a pitch. They're on about the 40, 45-yard line. And he's very fast, but he's coming around the corner, and there's at least two guys that have the angle. I'm thinking, okay, he's going to get a short gain. And somehow he kicks in this extra gear, and he literally runs past everybody down the sideline for a 45-yard touchdown on his first carry. And the rest of the game was more of the same. And it was incredible, but it was his version in that stage of his life of living this way that we described. And so, yes, they received it. They received the message, but it would require, and still does require, us constantly, recalibrating of what does that expression look like.
What a story. I feel like you just described a movie there, that football.
It felt like it. Yeah.
Thing. And I'm curious, I'm listening to you work through this, and obviously, when there's a trauma, and we all have them from time to time, we all react differently, but I'm hearing you describe this process in very calm, methodical. We're going to talk through this. We're going to work through this. Was that who you were normally, or was that how you showed up in the situation? I'm just curious, because a lot of us, react differently. And I think, given the gravity of this situation, I just, going through my mind, I'm like, wow, you're just like methodically going through this. Was that your normal MO?
Yeah, that's funny. That, I'm pretty sure no one's asked me that yet. And I've done quite a few interviews. That's a great question. That answer actually has two sides, in my opinion. When I look over the course of my lifetime, it's funny, I can, like some people, completely overreact to smaller things.
Yeah. That I can relate to.
Yes. I'm more than capable of being too intense and not responding calmly and methodically to smaller issues of life, without question. I don't know what it is about, just how I was created, but when there has been really hard things, I have tended to, there's a switch that just flips, and I am able to manage that.
I can relate to that. Honestly, yeah. That's why I asked you the question. I was in a car accident once. My wife and I lived in Houston, Texas for 9 years, now in Atlanta. So I'm very familiar with traffic.
Yeah.
But I was in a car accident. I got rear-ended by an F-150, and he clipped me pretty good. And it literally looked like the back end of the car had been sawed off, and he threw me into the steering wheel, and I broke a rib, and it was a kind of a scary scene. But I remember, catching my breath and, just stepped over to the side of the road and just very calmly called my wife and said, listen, I was in an accident. I'm okay. The cops are coming. And what I recall from that incident was how calm I was just throughout the entire process. And I've found on certain times when, like, it's like you're saying, the small things, man, that irritates, that I can get really angry.
Right.
But that, I remember that incident like it was yesterday, because I honestly feel very fortunate that I only broke a rib and I had a couple of scratches. I mean, it was a pretty serious automobile accident. And, but I just remember how calm I was. And that's, I was listening to you and I'm like, wow, that sounds really kind of familiar in terms of like the process that I went through, in that particular incident. And, so I was just curious.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I've been in accidents too. And even a couple of years after Gabriel passed, my son Joel ended up hitting a median on our main highway, or one of our main highways here, at 75 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And if you saw the vehicle, and even the paramedics and everybody afterwards, they were like, nobody walks away from that. And so he really, by all intent purposes, and the natural, should not be with us. I would have lost another son, and literally all he had was one little scratch. If I were to send you the pictures, it's remarkable. And I remember feeling kind of the same way in that moment. But I think, it's important, because I don't want your listeners to get the wrong impression either about that, because did I have a plan, which I felt like God was a big part of giving me that plan. I need to point that out. I really felt like I was getting a divine download in real time as well. But did I have, a plan, and were there some methods to the madness? Yes. Did we do that perfectly? No.
Well,
this was still, again, I like the word compass. I've used that a lot since I've started speaking about this, because that's what it did. It kept recalibrating us. Our methods kept recalibrating us when we would start to get off track, and when we would feel certain ways. Because it's a devastating blow, and it's something that you do go up and down, and you experience different things. I call the first year of this kind of a loss the shock and awe phase. The reason why I call it that is because until you've gone through an entire year, calendar year, you have not experienced yet all of the firsts: the birthday, the Christmas, the Thanksgiving, the other kids turning 21, which just happened this last year for us, but it's different things like that. So, there's this shock and awe phase part to it, but I did have enough, I think, wisdom and experience to know that we did need some methods, something to recalibrate. So, it was just a living, breathing thing. And Big Bold Brave, where it came from, was actually the morning of, and it was something that helped too. And what happened is, you can imagine, it's a plane crash, already news. It's a plane crash with a 17-year-old pilot, bigger news. So the news were reaching out to us the morning after to do a story. And one of them was NBC here in Dallas. The reporter's name was Katie, and she said, hey, would you guys be willing to do an interview? And she was very kind, very cautious in the way she spoke with me. So I don't want to imply that there was any rudeness here, but we were a train wreck. And so I'm like, there's no way possible that we can get through an interview. But you already know the compass that we set, and this life or death mentality. We'd already talked about that as a family. And she said something at the end of the call that was just striking. And I really believe it was God now. In that moment, it didn't feel like it. But she said, okay, well, listen, because this is pretty early in the day. She goes, if you change your mind, call me back. There's still time. But I just want to leave you with this thought. She said, I am assigned this story. I have to do the story. If I do it without you, all I'm really going to be able to do is report on his death. If you'll allow me, I'll even come to your home, which is what we did, and we can go through it slow. We can stop, we can start, but I'll allow you to tell his story about the way he lived.
Wow.
And you can include your faith as much as you want to. So I didn't say yes. I know I said, I'll think about it, hung up, and we actually had a family meeting. One of my other father-in-laws was here by that time too. And, he just said to me, and he was the most unlikely, I think, to endorse the idea for a variety of reasons. But he said, I think this is your first opportunity to speak life about Gabriel's life, And so we did that. So in the interview, what ultimately ended up happening is, somewhere in it, I said he lived his life big, bold, and brave. Don't remember saying it. But when she played the segment that night, we watched it on the news, and it was about a 3-minute segment, beautifully done. We were very, very pleased with how she put together our story and Gabriel's story. But at the end, before she signed off, she said, Gabriel's parents encourage you to live like Gabriel. Big, bold, and brave.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
And there was something, Mike, about hearing that back that there was life on it. There really was. There was life on it. Now, forget about the book. Forget about my company being called Big Bold Brave. That's a couple of years down the road. There was none of that.
Yeah.
But it did become just kind of a family mantra. And we didn't walk up and down the halls, Big Bold Brave, Big Bold Brave. We didn't do that. But when we would get punched in the face with emotions, and when at times maybe when we were struggling a little bit, or our middle son, who's now our oldest living son, they had just become best friends. So this last 4 years for him has been a war. And he's made some bad decisions along the way and hasn't always, processed the way that we would have chosen for him to process. And we've had to just continue to coach him and love him through it. But it was still something that we would just remind ourselves of. As a matter of fact, he was one of the first recipients because a person that we know heard that we said Big Bold Brave at the end of that, and he's a woodworker, and he actually sent us a sign, the very first thing that ever said Big Bold Brave, sent it to us, and Joel wanted that, and it's still to this day in his room. So that was the birth of the phrase Big Bold Brave, which was a family mantra that would ultimately become the name of my book, the name of my company, and really the mission that I'm on.
Talk about that. What does it mean to be big, bold, and brave? For the men in my audience, I love, I'm thinking about those 3 words, and they're so powerful in a world where a lot of men live passive lives these days, unfortunately. And I love this idea, big, bold, and brave, and how you're lifting Gabriel up. So talk about that.
Yeah, and that's a great question, Mike. And some of my answer may surprise some people, but there's something about death, and I love the way, by the way, how you framed our conversation. I'm just so grateful the way you did that. I thought that was just done so well, because when you lose someone, and I'm not going to say a child specifically, although I think we would all agree losing a child is very unnatural. It just goes against,
I can't imagine.
Yeah, everything that we, want to be true and believe about where our life is going to go. But anytime you lose any loved one that's really close to you, it causes you, and actually, I guess I should say it this way for some, because not everybody, some people just get buried in their pain and they go down a rabbit hole and sometimes never to return. Yeah. But if you have again, I'll just use the word life mentality, where you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I even move forward? Because you don't move on from losing your son, but you do have to find a way to move forward in your life. And so with that, it's one of those things where you just begin to look at everything in your life, because life becomes incredibly precious to your early point.
Yeah.
We all know from a logical standpoint that we're all going to die someday. We all know that if we live long enough, we're probably going to lose someone close to us. That's a reality of life. But thank goodness that we don't dwell on that, right? We shouldn't like live in fear and dwell on that point. But it is a reality of our existence on this side of eternity. And so when it happened, we, over the course of, once we got past the first few months, because it took some time to get on any kind of a rhythm that was anything remotely close to our normal rhythm. Once we began to try to just function normally, if I could say it that way, my wife and I had a lot of conversations about everything in our life, about the way we spent our time, what's on our calendar. Do I want to be a pastor for the rest of my life? We had started church. I didn't mention that, but we had actually just started church a few months before Gabriel's accident. Had really just started to even look for a place, because we started as a house church. And so that was like, is that really what we're not just called to do, but do we have the capacity for that? Do we even want to do that? The people that we spend most of our time with, because we all know that's really important.
Yeah.
As far as who you become. And so we looked at everything. We underturned every rock. And so what that led me to as a man is I looked at my life. I looked at the things that I had thought about doing. One of those was, for years, I had talked about stepping outside of just the four walls of the church, not necessarily quitting being a pastor, but doing something on side and being a coach, because I really wanted to reach other people and help other people besides those who just happen to walk inside the building,
Yeah.
And some other things. I had known I was supposed to write a book for probably decades. I mean, I had people all the time asking me, when are you going to write a book? When are you going to write a book? Not due to that story, obviously, but just other parts of my life that people were aware of. And so what it did, Mike, is it revealed cowardice.
Oh,
Looking at my son's life and inspired by the way he lived his, in albeit a far shorter time than we would have chosen, I think it's fair to say that in just under 18 years, he lived more life, and he pursued and was even living a part of his dream more than most people ever do. And I realized that even though I was courageous in areas of my life, I wasn't a coward in every area of my life. We've made some very bold moves over the year. We've moved, on what we believe a word of God, and packed up everything and moved to another state. And, there's a lot of different stories I could tell you. We've done some courageous things, and I have, as a man and the leader of my home. But his death revealed some pockets of cowardice. And I even write that in the book. And I just, it just did something in me that I'm like, gosh, I can't live this way anymore, because it was just fear, Mike. It's just fear. Fear kept me from writing a book. Fear kept me from launching the company, excuses and all this stuff. So ultimately, that's what his inspiration did. And that mantra of big, bold, brave, eventually when I decided, okay, I'm going to launch a personal development company, and I'm going to start coaching people, professional people outside of here. I'd been doing it in the church, but, just in a different setting. And so that was step one. And then what really happened with the book, Mike, was COVID.
Yeah.
And I'll explain, and what I mean by that is timing. If COVID would not have hit, that was 3 months after Gabriel passed away. So only 3 months after his death, we, like the rest of the world, was wrestling with, okay, what is going on? And as time went on, it just got weirder and, more devastating in so many ways. And so I may have taken years to write this book. I really don't know. But after about 2 years of just watching the way our world had been completely flipped upside down, and not just by a virus, but by the decisions of men and women, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to make a political statement here. I'm sincerely not. I'm just going to approach it from the one thing that I have yet to find anybody that, even if they disagree with me on how I felt about the way things were handled and what decisions were good and what were crazy, is that fear was unleashed on our planet in ways that we've never experienced before. And it filtered into a lot of areas of our world, and racism exploded again. And the whole concept, gender issues. Now it's like, what is a gender? All these things. Fear was just unleashed in unprecedented ways. And because we have it in our hand all the time, right, through something called a smartphone, that information is constantly bombarding, And so that's really why I decided to write the book when I did, because Big Bold Brave is not a grieving book, although it will talk about some of the things I just described to you in terms of our processes and what was healthy for us. But ultimately, it goes way beyond that. It goes to the values and the character traits and the mindsets that we have lived by over the years to crush fear.
Yeah. Talk more about that. How can we live a big, bold, and brave life? Speaking to the hearts of men on this one right now, how can we live more big, bold, and brave so that we can be present and accountable for our families that so dearly need men to be big, bold, and brave right now?
Well, I think one thing I want to start with quickly is we need to recognize that we were likely not trained that way.
True.
100%. There are, of course, there's exceptions, but I would say far and away, men were not really trained well in that department. And again, I'm a man of faith. I was in church for many years. I'm including in that group, that group as well. And so there's a lot of self-awareness that has to take place before you can live big, bold, and brave for yourself, because it starts with you. You know, I'm using this phrase now, Mike, courageous decisions. It just fits where I'm at now. And it fits, frankly, even my branding. But, I've said for years, I would be the one who constantly got, if somebody was fighting a drug addiction or meth or, whatever the issue was, men in particular, they would normally get sent to my office. Because I'm
go to the principal's office.
Yeah. And well, partly because, part of my story is overcoming a lot of those things.
Sure.
And so they would end up in my office and ultimately, like even pornography, we all know that for most men, or at least a large percentage of men, the data is pretty clear. A lot of men struggle with that. And I remember even many times coaching a young man or older man that was dealing with it. And so we would talk about some things where you could cut off access and do certain things to essentially make it a little easier to not fall into that.
Yeah.
But I would always tell them the same thing. And this is where we start with your question. And that is, at the end of the day, and I used to back then just say strong, you need to make a strong decision. Now I call it courageous. It starts with a courageous decision. Nobody besides you can be the one who sets in motion that you're going to live a big, bold, brave life, that you're going to lead your family well, that you're going to become the man that you were created to be, despite your past, despite what you've thought about yourself in the past, despite what others have said about you in your past. You have to make a decision that I'm going to change things. So it starts with that. And then I think, once you've made that decision, one of the things that I do and I like to do is I really believe it's important to figure out what stories you're telling yourself and what you're listening to. And so there's different ways you can do this, but one's a simple exercise. You can just simply get a piece of paper, draw a little, cross. You got a simple 2-sided chart there and just start to write out, what are things that I do really well. I always love starting with something that, we can be encouraged by personally. Right. You don't have to do it that way, but I like that. So what are things that I've been encouraged by about me? What are things that I do well? And then you got to look at what are some things where I know I have some weaknesses. But ultimately, where that exercise should land is write out. And this is the way I've done it with some people. I know it's going to sound a little morbid to some, but write out your eulogy.
I listen, I've done that. It's incredibly, I found it to be incredibly cathartic. I get it. The weird part of it, but
it sounds strange, but my point for that is just simply, if you can't even write out how you want people to remember you, then you clearly don't have a plan and are not working a plan for that to happen, right? You're leaving everything up to just happenstance.
Yeah.
So to me, those are two really critical foundational stages. Is first, making the courageous decision yourself that you're going to make a change. And then secondly, figuring out, who do I want to be? What do I want the characteristics to be? And a lot of men listening right now are probably thinking, well, how would I answer that? Because I've been asked, it's a normal thing for podcasts. People say, tell me who Clint is, and honestly, going back even a few years ago, I would have given you a list of accomplishments.
Right. Yeah.
That's what I would have done.
Yeah.
Well, I've spoken in front of thousands of people and I've done this and I've done that, and I don't answer it that way anymore.
Which is cool, right? But, and I get that. Like, I'm humbled by so many things that are coming at me right now, but that's not who I am.
Exactly.
That's what I do. And men, if you're listening to this right now and you go, what did he just say? Yeah, I just said it. I'm calling it out, So yes, Clint. Continue, please.
No, I was waiting to see where you were going to go. You look like you had something. You were beginning to flow there.
Well, no, man. Listen. This is so important. The information that you're giving to. I mean, you're talking about something that was percolating probably, but in loss. This whole idea of being big and bold and brave has come to the surface, and it's just so beautiful. So. People don't want to hear me right now. They want to hear you.
well, I appreciate you saying that. I do. This isn't shifting gears too much, but there's something I would love to say to all the men right now that are listening, when you post this. And then of course, we don't know when people are going to watch this, right? It could be 2 years from now, But
Yeah.
I really believe, and it's on my website, I believe 3 things about every human being, so certainly every man. And I believe they can all be proven. And the first one is we were created to be courageous. And I'm actually very interested that you gave your example of in your accident and you felt this, use the word calm. I felt this calmness, and I was almost kind of surprising myself, that I
Yeah.
responded this
Yeah.
way. And I really believe that that's courage that's inside of you that just needed an opportunity for it to kick into gear. And so to me, that was a form of
Yeah.
courage because that's, man, anybody that's ever been in a wreck, the sound, the feel, and then you were injured as well and got a broken rib, it's a lot to deal with. And yet I believe that God-given created courage inside of you came out to be able to handle what was necessary in the moment. And go ahead.
I've told so many people this. Doing a podcast was conquering a fear. Now, some people may laugh at that. I had no experience sitting behind a microphone, doing anything like this. And it took a lot of courage. In fact, when Paul Bailey and I started this, I tell everybody it took some liquid courage, as a matter of fact, to hit the record button that first couple of times. But as a result of being courageous and doing this, God had a gift for me, and I got to unwrap it, and I didn't know that gift was even available. And so, this whole idea of being courageous really resonates with me, because really what we're talking about when we're talking about being courageous is taking a risk.
Yeah.
Now, a calculated one. Okay. Don't go stand next to a cliff someplace. Not a good idea. Okay.
Right.
But, taking a prayerful, thoughtful risk in your life can be incredibly giving. That's been my experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, the point of this whole thing of even talking about courage is it's inside of you.
Oh,
it's
absolutely.
not this nebulous thing out there. You don't have to go search for it. You don't have to order it on Amazon and wait 2 days for it to show up. It's in you already. And it's just waiting for an opportunity, and we see it sometimes. I saw a story, man, it'll blow you away. It was one of those little reels, I think, but it was a teenage kid who a lady had drove her SUV into a frozen lake, and it was starting to submerge. And there's a few other people that were standing on the edge that weren't doing anything. But this kid immediately jumped into that frozen lake, climbed into the back, ultimately ends up pulling her and her dog out. What is that? That's courage that was already in him. Sometimes the circumstance requires instant courage, and it's already in you, so you act. But for most of us men, we don't encounter ladies submerging in a frozen lake very often, and so usually choosing courage takes a little more thoughtful intention, like you just said. So I'm glad you put it the way you did. So that's courage, right? And then the second thing I believe about every human is we were created with a creative genius, a unique creative genius. Now, I may not have time to tell the whole story that would fit this well, but I'll just try to give you a 30,000 foot. I don't know if you've ever heard, but NASA did a study. They brought in a couple of scientists years ago to create a test where they could measure the creative genius of their rocket scientists, with the purpose of being able to determine, and by creative genius meaning your innate ability to take information in and come up with creative solutions and ideas, right? We're not talking about painting a canvas or playing a guitar. And so they came in to do this test. Well, it ended up being wildly successful because they wanted to do it to figure out who they could give the toughest problems to.
Yeah.
So these scientists ultimately ended up taking outside of that 1,600 kids, ages 4 and 5. This test was so simple that they could administer it to a child that age, but they were curious what they would discover. So I'm not going to give you all the stats as they did through the years, because they checked them about every 5 years. But the very first test they gave them at 4 and 5 years old, take a wild guess how many you think tested as a creative genius.
I'm going to say it must have been I don't know.
I'm leading you. Yeah, that's right. You're like,
don't know.
probably a high number the way you phrase that, you know? Yeah, yeah.
I'm like,
98%, Mike. 98%. Let that sink in for a second.
have any of life's BS.
Right. No, exactly. So again, we don't need to go through every 5 years, but by the time they tested them, and at this point they were like 25 to 31 years old, in that range, it was all the way down to 2.
Yeah.
And actually, after the first 5 years, it dropped from 98 all the way down into like 36 or something. I'm forgetting the number now, but it's in the 30s. So what is that? Well, what we discover is that creative genius is inside of you. But as you said, life has punched you in the mouth. It's probably partly our school system, which is not designed for every type of learner to be successful, right? But the point is, men, it's in you. Now, I will leave this because I wouldn't want to say that to you without leaving you some hope, because you're not doomed, you know,
Right.
you're not doomed to stay at 2%, you know, and that is what they went on, because it was such a fascinating study. This particular scientist just kept going. He ended up testing over 1 million people with the same results. And what he found out is that the type of, and this is where we're not going to get in the weeds, but there's 2 major types of thinking process that involves that creative genius nature is always in us. God has designed it that way. What is it? It's the same process that you use when you're dreaming.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
I love that. And it's one of the reasons that I'm sure is the same thing that you do. And I'm a firm believer of this. And I've had people try to talk me out of this. The coaching process is something that I really love. And there's a science to it, because we all have the answers inside of us. Sometimes we just need somebody that has the gift to ask a good question, to walk alongside us and just take the time to listen and ask the questions and help you develop, the answers. Cause I just, that's what happened to me, and it happened by being involved around being around a group of men that were going through some of the, same faith things and some of the same life things. And I think that's the most interesting part, right? We discover, we're not alone. And that's where so many men get this wrong. Like, well, I'm on an island. Well, you're not on an island.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Clint, as you know, there are people that have experienced their children being, in some kind of traumatic accident, and they lost them. Yeah. And it's awful. It's awful. But, we can move on from that to some degree. And, in that, look where you're at. Not only are you helping make an impact on the lives of other men and other families and other people, you're essentially lifting Gabriel up every time you do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is,
and that's just beautiful
for me. Yeah. Thank you. That's definitely a huge part for me. I call that part giving our pain a purpose, because the truth is, I said earlier, you're always going to have the pain when you lose a loved one, because it represents that love shared. But the trick, if there is such a thing, is that you can tell your pain where to go. Yeah. So you can choose to your pain can either identify you and keep you trapped, or you can tell it how to behave. And for me, part of that was creating what I've created and bringing Gabriel into my story of how I'm living Big Bold Brave. He wasn't an author, he wasn't a personal development coach, but I'm bringing him into that, and that's been very cathartic as well. And, and I love it, and you've segued me perfectly to the third final point, because it's really a large part of my mission and why you do what you do. And that is, we were all created to be compassionate. It's in you as well. And there's men out there right now, I guarantee that they maybe have never been good at showing their emotions, and their wives are probably beating them over the head with it, or even their kids, and that kind of thing. And you think, well, I wasn't raised that way or whatever. Dude, you have it within you, inside of you, just like courage, just like creative genius. You have the ability to be compassionate. And sometimes life circumstances will amplify that. And that's what happened with me. I really feel like I was a compassionate person. You know, I mean, I was hopefully, right. I was a pastor for 17 years. Hopefully that was a characteristic. But there was something about losing Gabriel and just our journey since that I just have a much greater compassion for people in general, humans in general, and what they may be going through, because often we don't know, right?
Yeah, and you know, compassion is something that we need more of right now. We need heavy doses of it. How about that?
Absolutely.
Just leave it at that. But we need heavy doses of it globally.
That's right.
You know, it's just so easy to say, well, here in the United States, but you know, a lot of the same crap's going on everywhere, quite honestly,
Absolutely.
right now.
Yeah.
That's why it's a good time to flip off the news. Clint, listen, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and telling your story, and tell everybody as we wrap up here how they can get a hold of you. We will, of course, put this in the show notes, but how can they get a hold of the book? How can they get a hold of you?
Two choices with the book. You can, but I want to start with go to bigbullbrave.us. I like to say bigbullbrave.us. I chose that domain for that reason.
There you
I
go.
believe I do. I believe in the
I
power.
wondered why that was like that. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Yeah. I say it now up front because everybody always corrects me when I say .us. You know, that's .us, right? I'm like, yes, I know that, but
I got it.
But bigbullbrave.us, and they can get the book there. Now we probably have some international listeners, so it's better for them to go to Amazon because it's available everywhere for shipping purposes more than anything else. But I'd love for them to go to bigbullbrave.us. You can see more about our story, but you can also find out about my speaking, my coaching, and some of the things there as well. And I have a newsletter I just started, Mike, in February. That's just once every Friday, and I just give away a free coaching tip, share some things that I love, and just give some updates on the mission of Big Bull Brave. So I would love for people to connect with me there.
Awesome. Everybody go do that. And Clint, again, thank you for coming on and sharing your story. It's a tough story to hear, but it needs to be heard. And that's the beauty of story is that, you know, somewhere along the line, people can hopefully understand they're not alone in their own grieving, their own loss, that there is life available to move forward. So thank you so much for coming on and telling your story.
Yeah, absolutely. It was my honor, Mike. And I just appreciate you, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Super. Thanks, Clint.